On April 11, 1979, Amin Dada, the terror of Uganda, paced around in his office. He had to make a split-second decision. He had two options. He could stay and fight against the warriors who were bringing fire to his doorstep, or he could run like a coward. He chose to run, and as the rebel army marched on the nation's capital, Amin looked down with sorrow in his eyes and fear in his heart.
And I will never give up. If I wanted to do something, I would never change my mind.
How did he get here? How did Amin Dada rise to become Africa's most bloodthirsty tyrant? And how did his empire fall? This is the story of Uganda's most brutal dictator as it has never been told. The Butcher of Uganda. He was known by many names: the Butcher of Uganda, President for Life, the Conqueror of the British Empire, and many, many more overqualifying monikers. His legacy was written in blood, not of him or his men, but of the men who stood against him, innocent men whose lives were snuffed out by the hands of a brutal leader. His story has been told many times, and this one seeks to take you to the very root of his life, guiding you through his journey from a humble soldier to one of the most brutal warlords in the history of any African country. To understand the tale of the tragic end of Amin Dada, the most bloodthirsty tyrant in Africa, let us go back to the very beginning. Chapter 1. Genesis, 1928. The year many people believe Amin Dada was born. The man was a mystery all his life, and even in death, so many aspects of his life remain puzzling. A good example of this is the air of confusion that surrounds the year of his birth. You see, while Amin was alive, he didn't write an autobiography, so he didn't tell his story by himself. And he also didn't authorize any official documentation of his life history, so his story didn't get written by anyone else. Because of this, there are discrepancies about when exactly he was born, but historians have narrowed it down to between 1923 and 1928. But who were his parents? According to a researcher at Makerere University, Fred Guedico, Amin was the son of Andreas Niabire, a member of the Kakwa ethnic group. In 1910, Amin's father converted from the Roman Catholic religion to Islam, and so he changed his name from Andreas Niabire to Amin Dada, which was how Idi Amin got his iconic full name. Amin was born in a place called Koboko in northwestern Uganda, and shortly after he was born, his family fell apart. His father left the home and never looked back, not at his beloved wife, not at the son he named after himself. Young Idi Amin had to grow up without a father figure with his mother's family in a rural farming town in northwestern Uganda. His mother's identity has also been confirmed to be a woman named Asa Aate, who belonged to the Lugbara ethnic group. Life was tough for Amin and his family, but he kept a good faith just like every Ugandan at the time. In 1941, young Amin enrolled in an Islamic school in Bombo. After a few years, he left the school with only a fourth-grade English language education. He would later go on to do several odd jobs just to get by, until he got his big break. Chapter 2. The boy became a soldier. Rising from the ashes of poverty in Uganda wasn't an easy feat. Life was exceptionally hard for those who were in the rural areas. War and violence was never far behind, and the people lived in fear all the days of their lives. It was with this backdrop that Amin sought a refuge in the arms of the military. He felt he was born for it, and the allure of bearing arms in the defense of his country filled his heart. He wanted to be a soldier. He knew this was what he was meant to be. So he found his way in through a British colonial army officer. His first assignment was with the British King's African Rifles, also known as the KR. Amin became a part of this special unit in 1946, but he was not yet a soldier. He was an assistant cook. However, even though his responsibilities were limited to the kitchen, he also received military training on the side. No one could argue that Amin wasn't built for the military. He was a mountain of a man, who towered over everybody else at 6 feet 4 inches. He was like a Hulk, and his character matched his stature. He was a man who looked tough and talked tough. Soon, his time to shine bright on the battlefield came when he was transferred to Kenya for infantry service as a private. This was in 1947. Amin served in the 21st KR Infantry Battalion in Gilgil, Kenya colony until the year 1949. It was in that year that his team got transferred to northern Kenya to lend a hand in the fight against Somali rebels. Then, in 1952, his brigade was also deployed to fight against the Mau Mau rebels in Kenya. By 1953, Amin, who was now a sergeant, had amassed more stories than he could ever tell. Then, in 1959, he was made the Effendi Class II Warrant Officer, which was the highest rank possible for a black African in the colonial British military at the time. He was on top of the world, and this would come as an advantage later on. It was in 1959 that Amin returned to Uganda, where he received a short service commission as a lieutenant on July 15, 1961. On this day, he became one of the first two Ugandans to become commissioned officers. Although this meant an increase in his ranks and privileges, it also meant more responsibilities. One of his first tasks was to squash cattle rustling between Uganda's Karamojong and Kenya's Turkana nomads. It was a delicate task that required absolute care, and Amin's experience in the colonial military made him a perfect fit for the role. His leadership style was unique. Unlike many of the others, he employed a more direct and hands-on approach to his leadership, and this made him quite popular. But another unexpected event was about to rock the whole country and set Amin on the path to the throne he was destined for. Chapter 3. The Journey to the Top. October 9, 1962 is a day the Ugandan people will always remember. It was the day the nation broke free from its colonial chains and became a truly free state. Now that the hands of the United Kingdom were off the merchandise, at least on the outside, it was time for the people to take over the reins of their leadership. One of the men who was at the forefront of Uganda's leadership was Idi Amin, who got promoted to captain in the same year the nation gained independence. His rise from then on was like a rocket blazing through the skies. In 1963, he was promoted from captain to major, but that's not where it ended. The following year, he stepped up even higher and became the deputy commander of the army. Then in 1975, he became the commander of the army. By 1970, Idi Amin Dada had become the commander of all the armed forces. It was a rise no one saw coming, not even Amin himself. But his journey would soon encounter a major roadblock. It came in the form of a smuggling deal gone wrong, implicating both Amin and the then Ugandan Prime Minister Milton Obote. Obote and Amin were both part of this illegal deal to smuggle ivory and gold into Uganda from the Democratic Republic of the Congo. According to General Nicholas Olenga, an associate of the former Congolese leader Patrice Lumumba, the deal was to aid the efforts of the troops who were opposed to the Congolese government. By supplying them with gold and ivory, these rebels would be able to afford new weapons to continue their senseless reign of violence. As the details of this deal began to emerge from the shadows, the Ugandan parliament got in on the action. In 1966, the parliament demanded an investigation into the whole debacle. But Obote wasn't having it. Instead of allowing the law to take its course, he instead imposed a new constitution which abolished the ceremonial presidency held by Kabaka Mutesa II of Buganda. Since there was no one else who could challenge his authority, he then declared himself the executive president. This was, unfortunately, the beginning of his downfall. Following these new developments, Amin was also promoted to colonel and army commander, as it was he who made Mutesa's exit from government possible. He had led an attack on the Kabaka Palace, forcing Mutesa into exile to the United Kingdom. With Uganda laid bare in the hands of Amin and Obote, Amin began to craft his own grand plan of taking over the government. But first, he had to lay a very solid foundation for himself. So he began recruiting members of Kakwa, Lugbara, South Sudanese, and other ethnic groups from the West Nile area bordering South Sudan. Amin's plan was gradually coming together like pieces of a puzzle, and soon it was time to claim the highest seat in the nation. Chapter 4. Amin seizes power. Even though Amin and Obote seemed to get along quite well, trouble was brewing behind the scenes. Eventually, a rift began to develop between the two due to a couple of pivotal events that had taken place. First was Amin's involvement in operations to support the rebellion in southern Sudan, as well as an attempt on Obote's life in 1969. By October 1970, Obote decided to take action, so he took control of the armed forces and reduced Amin from the post of commander of all armed forces to that of the commander of the Uganda army. But Obote wasn't done. In secret, he was planning to arrest Amin for misappropriating some army funds, so Amin decided to act fast before he lost everything. With the reputation he had built in the military, it wasn't hard to pull together a team of soldiers who were also willing to topple the Obote government. Added to that, Amin had help from Israeli government agents, so the recipe was complete. Then the D-Day came. January 25, 1971, the day that Uganda's history would change forever. Prime Minister Milton Obote was attending the Commonwealth Summit meeting in Singapore at the time. But at home, the military was rallying behind Idi Amin to march on the government house. First, troops loyal to Amin sealed off Entebbe International Airport and took over the capital Kampala. Then the soldiers surrounded Obote's residence and blocked all the major toads. Then the people of Uganda heard a voice from the radio, the voice of their new ruler, Idi Amin Dada. In his broadcast, he accused Obote's government of corruption, announcing himself as the savior of the Ugandan people. As soon as the speech was completed, celebrations erupted in the streets, as everyone rallied around their new ruler. To the people of Uganda, this was a welcome development. After all, they've been under the Obote government for quite some time, and the economy didn't seem to get any better. Maybe Amin was indeed their savior. The man did not even present himself as a politician or a leader. Instead, he made it known that he was just a passionate soldier who wanted to see his country move forward. He also declared that the nation would only be under the rulership of the military government for a transitional period until new elections were conducted. But none of these promises were ever kept, and unknown to the Uganda people, this would turn out to be a chapter they would never forget in their history. On the international scene, Amin's rise to power was met with both enthusiasm and caution. While the United States and the United Kingdom saw Amin as a tool to wage war against communism in the region, the international community didn't want to get onto the dance floor with a man they couldn't predict or control. Because of this, other Ugandan allies also exercised a great deal of caution in showing support for Amin's regime. But Amin was about to prove everyone right and wrong at the same time. Chapter 5. The Reign of Amin. Leaders come and leaders go, but their legacies never die. Amin's legacy, written in blood, remains one of the most retold stories in African history. On February 2, 1971, just a week after the successful coup, Idi Amin Dada declared himself the President of Uganda, Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces, Uganda Army Chief of Staff, and Chief of Air Staff. He also altered the nation's constitution, suspending some certain provisions that would inhibit his absolute grip on power. Soon, he also instituted an advisory defense council, which was composed of other military officers like himself, while he served as the council's chairman. Gone were the days of democracy. It was now time for the military regime to take over. But as history has proven time and time again, soldiers sometimes form the worst leaders. But Idi Amin didn't care. He broke down the system of civil law and instituted military tribunals, placing soldiers in government positions and government-owned corporations. The newly inducted civilian cabinet ministers were also subjected to military courtesy. Amin's leadership approach was to rule by decree. Gone were the days when decisions would have to be carefully examined, and Uganda's new ruler only gave orders which had to be strictly followed. Within his first few months in office, Amin renamed the presidential lodge in Kampala from government house to the command post, taking away any semblance of democratic rule. He was also careful to eliminate anyone who could work to topple his government. To achieve this, he disbanded the General Service Unit, an intelligence agency that was created by the previous government, replacing it with his own State Research Bureau of SRB. But this was no intelligence agency. Instead, the SRB headquarters in Kampala became more like a concentration camp, where political prisoners were detained, tortured, and sometimes even executed. Anyone who didn't show public support for Amin's government was targeted and imprisoned, from the scholars to previous political leaders, to even members of the military. Even though the people of Uganda jubilated on the day Amin took over power, they had unknowingly placed themselves at the mercy of a monster, and no one was spared from his wrath. The purging of the army came after the botched invasion attempt by Ugandan exiles in 1972. After the insurgence was quelled, Amin began taking precautions by removing everyone who supported Obote's regime from the military, especially those from the Acholi and Lango ethnic groups. Although the massacre had begun earlier in 1971, by 1972, over 5,000 Acholi and Lango soldiers had mysteriously disappeared. The casualty was even worse on the civilian side, as the number reached well over 10,000. These victims also included the members of other ethnic groups, religious leaders, artists, judges, lawyers, journalists, foreign nationals, and even students. It was like a massive roundup of everyone who didn't show absolute support for the Amin government. Bodies filled the Nile River as countless civilians lost their lives to the unbridled stream of violence. Soon, thousands of Ugandans were fleeing the country to neighboring Tanzania, where the former Prime Minister Obote was holed up. By 1972, over 20,000 Ugandan refugees had fled into the country in the hope of a better life than they had in their home country. Motivated by ethnic, political, and financial reasons, Amin and his men continued the senseless killing of their own kinsmen for the entire 8 years he was in control. Till today, the number of people who fell victim to Amin's thirst for blood remains unknown. However, according to the International Commission of Jurists, no fewer than 80,000 Ugandans lost their lives, and some estimates even peg the number at about 300,000. But those are not even the worst numbers. According to a study conducted by Amnesty International, the number of victims is actually around 500,000. To gain an understanding of Amin's brutality from an eyewitness standpoint, here's an excerpt from a book titled State of Blood, The Inside Story of IDI Amin, written by a man named Henry Kiemba, who was a minister in Amin's cabinet for 3 years. According to Kiemba, Amin's bizarre behavior could be traced back to his tribal background. The Kakwa, just like many of the warrior societies, were known to practice blood rituals on their slain enemies. These strange rituals involved cutting a piece of their flesh so as to subdue the man's spirit. Sometimes the victor would taste the victim's blood so as to render the man's spirit harmless. This insight revealed the multifaceted battle Amin waged on his enemies. He wasn't content with just taking their lives, he also wanted to subdue their spirits. But Amin didn't stop at cutting off the flesh or tasting their blood. Taking the ritual to a whole new level, Amin delved into the world of cannibalism, as there are reports that he actually consumed human flesh. Although these stories have never been confirmed, Kiemba clearly stated that Amin had boasted to him and others that he had consumed human flesh. But that aside, Amin's reign of terror touched far and wide. Among the list of prominent Ugandans who lost their lives at the hands of the merciless dictator was Benedictor Kiwanuka, the first Prime Minister of Uganda, who was also a Chief Justice. He was also one of the people who spearheaded the movement to liberate Uganda from the colonial regime, but Amin had a score to settle with the political leader. However, Kiwanuka and Amin's relationship started on a good note. Before Amin's ascent to power, Kiwanuka was one of the political leaders who were imprisoned by Obote's government. But immediately after Amin ascended to the throne, he released many of these political prisoners, including Kiwanuka, and even made him the Chief Justice of Uganda. However, Kiwanuka couldn't stand Amin's blatant disregard for the rule of law. Although he was grateful for having a voice in Amin's government, Kiwanuka couldn't sit by and watch Amin run Uganda to the ground. So, he would sometimes countermand some of Amin's draconian decrees. Even worse, he began to collude with other people of like minds to bring Obote back to power, provided he would be part of the new government. This was the greatest of Kiwanuka's sins, and soon he would suffer the wrath of the president. On September 22, 1972, Kiwanuka was executed at the Makindye military prison, but his death was far from quick and painless. According to reports, the former prime minister suffered a slow execution, which would be too graphic to describe with words. First, his ears, nose, and lips were severed. Then his arms were removed, and his internal organs were extracted. Then he was castrated, before he was finally immolated. This was one of the most brutal executions ever carried out by Amin's regime, and it was to serve as an example to other political agitators who may want to rise against his rule. But Kiwanuka wasn't the only Ugandan politician to lose his hands at the hands of the dictator. There was also Janani Luwum, the Anglican archbishop, Joseph Mubiru, the former governor of the Central Bank of Uganda, Byron Kawadwa, a prominent playwright, Frank Kalamuzo, the vice-chancellor of Makerere University, and even two people from his own cabinet, Irenai Wilson Oryema and Charles Oboth Ofumbi. No one was safe, not even in their houses. If Amin wanted someone gone, the person would simply disappear without a trace. This constant flow of blood became quite worrying for the international community, and many of them began to put some distance between themselves and Amin's government. But in his ignorance, Amin was about to make one of the greatest mistakes of his life. Chapter 6. The Economic War. Whoever the gods want to kill, they first make mad, says an African proverb. This was the case in the story of Idi Amin. As his reign of terror continued to plunge the nation deeper and deeper into crisis, Amin sought an even more creative way to make himself a subject of controversy. This time, it was focused on the international community. It all began in August 1972, when the Amin government declared what he described as an economic war. This involved the introduction of policies that included the expropriation of properties owned by Asians and Europeans. This meant that those properties would now be owned by the Ugandan government. Of the 80,000 Asians who lived in Uganda, most of them were from the Indian subcontinent and were born in Uganda. Their ancestors had traveled to the African country in the search for greener pastures while the nation was still a British colony. Now the land was turning against them. Throughout the years, many of them had built businesses in the country, established large-scale enterprises, and they formed the backbone of Uganda's economy. But now everything they had worked for was going to be grabbed by the power-hungry regime. It was a time of great sorrow for Asians in Uganda, but the worst was yet to come. On August 4, 1972, President Amin issued a decree ordering the expulsion of 50,000 Asians who held British passports. But that's not all. Another extra 60,000 Asians who were not Uganda citizens were also forced to leave the country, pushing them out of the land they called home. This massive exodus saw Asians emigrating from Uganda to several parts of the world. Some went to Australia, others to South Africa and Canada. Some moved to India and Pakistan, others to Sweden and the United States, and about 30,000 of them emigrated to the United Kingdom. After they had been expelled, Amin took over their businesses and handed them over to his supporters. However, without the able hands of the original business owners, many of these businesses began to crumble. With no operational expertise and no maintenance, some of the factories began to fold up, and this dealt a heavy blow on the Ugandan economy, which was already struggling for air. Before their expulsion, Asians accounted for up to 90% of Uganda's tax revenue, and with them gone, the administration lost a chunk of the money and the economy collapsed. At this point, the international community began to pull back, but in reality, Idi Amin was the monster they made. To understand the part played by many Western powers in the Idi Amin story, let us go back to the very beginning. Chapter 7. The Monster You Made. It was the late 1960s, and the stage was set for a dramatic display between Obote's government and the international community. The former prime minister took a controversial move to the left and began nationalizing about 80 British companies, thereby putting a huge glowing target on his back. Then he also began to align with the Soviet Union, and if there was anything the West abhorred the most, it was the spread of communism. The British government got scared, and they knew they had to do something about Obote. And there he was, Amin, the man who would fit perfectly as their chosen puppet to take the throne away from Obote. He had proven himself in the suppression of the Mau Mau uprising and earned a reputation as a man who was intensely loyal to Britain. He was perfect, and they chose him to be Obote's successor. Without help from allies like Israel, the United Kingdom, and even West Germany, Amin would not have been as successful as he was. Since as far as 1966, the British had begun grooming Amin for power, and even throughout the first year of his presidency, he continued to receive key military and financial support from both the United Kingdom and Israel. But he soon began to lose favor with Israel. After his request for military hardware was declined, he turned to Libya for support. To gain the trust of Muammar Gaddafi, the Libyan leader, Amin denounced Zionism and severed his ties with the nation of Israel. His sacrifice paid off, as he was handed an immediate $25 million loan by Gaddafi, which was followed by more and more loans from Libya to Uganda. He also removed every single Israeli military advisor from his government before he finally broke all diplomatic relations with the Israeli government. This turned out to be a really big mistake, but Amin wasn't done. As part of his economic war, Amin severed ties with his greatest ally, the United Kingdom, and nationalized every single business owned by the British. In response, the United States and Israel ceased all trades with Uganda, but the space was soon filled by Libya, the United States, and of course, the Soviet Union. Amin's biggest mistake, however, took place in June 1976, when he allowed a hijacked Air France airliner that was flying from Tel Aviv to Paris to land at Entebbe Airport. The men in charge of the attack belonged to an armed group known as the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, External Operations, or PFLP-EO. With over 100 Jews and Israeli citizens being held hostage, the Israeli army launched a hugely successful rescue mission flying in commandos from Israel, who seized control of the airport. At the end of the day, almost all the hostages were rescued, and Amin was disgraced by the outcome of the whole debacle. Before we go on with the rest of the video, here's our subscribers' pick for today. The tale of the tragic end of Idi Amin Dada, the most bloodthirsty tyrant in Africa, is one that has been told many times, but it continues to haunt both Uganda and Africa as a whole. The pictures of his last days depict a man who was only a shadow of himself. Once upon a time, his presence alone would strike fear in the heart of even the most powerful soldier. But now he was a man at the mercy of the Saudi Arabian government, his existence holed up like a slave in a strange land. He could recall the days his words carried weight, and his commands crushed cities and laid villages bare. But here he was, a shadow of himself, the tyrant that fell from grace. As we explore this chilling story, tell us which part amazed or shocked you the most in the comments down below. Now let's get back to the video. The final chapter. By November 1978, Amin's government had broken down into pieces. Things were so bad that even some of his men turned against him. In response, the dictator sent troops against the mutineers who had fled into the Tanzanian border. As the fighting intensified, the Ugandan army crossed into Tanzanian territories under unclear circumstances, and war soon broke out between the two countries. In January 1979, Nyerere launched a counterattack against Amin and Uganda, backed by an army of Ugandan exiles who wanted to take the country back from the bloodthirsty dictator. By April 11, things were beginning to look really bad for Amin's army, and he had to flee Kampala on an helicopter after the capital was captured. After an unsuccessful attempt to establish a new capital in the city of Jinja, Idi Amin finally ran into exile. By the time he was unseated from the throne, Amin had become extremely unpopular among the masses, and he had very little supporters left. After he was removed, every building or monument that was associated was either destroyed or vandalized. But he escaped with his life and a damaged reputation, opting for a quiet life in neighboring Libya until 1980. In 1980, he moved to Saudi Arabia, and the royal family allowed him sanctuary and also paid him a generous subsidy as long as he stayed out of politics. But this wasn't enough for Amin, and in 1989, he left Saudi Arabia without the authorization of the Saudi government. His mission was to head back to Uganda, where he planned to mobilize a rebel force to reconquer the nation. He took a flight to Zaire, but was soon recognized, even though he used a fake passport. The Zaire government didn't want him there and attempted to expel him from their country. But Saudi Arabia also didn't want him back. He had abused the privilege he was given and taken advantage of their hospitality. So he was sent to Senegal instead, as Zaire attempted to escape any form of drama. However, the story still had a few more twists and turns. After Saudi Arabia refused to send Amin a visa, he was transferred back to Zaire from Senegal, bringing him back to square one. Luckily for him, he gained favor in the eyes of the Moroccan king Hassan II, who appealed to the Saudi government to allow Amin come back to Saudi Arabia, and they eventually agreed. However, Amin had to sign an agreement that he would never again participate in any political or military activity, nor give any interviews. So, Amin was finally allowed to go back to Saudi Arabia, where he would spend the rest of his life. On July 19, 2003, Amin fell into a coma, and an appeal was made to the then Ugandan president, Yoweri Museveni, to allow him come back home. But even in a vegetative state, Amin was not allowed to step foot in Uganda, else he would have to face the consequences of his crimes. According to the Ugandan people, his greatest sin was that he spilled the blood of his own people, so his life had to end far away from the land of his fathers. On August 16, 2003, Idi Amin's family disconnected the life support and the warlord of Uganda was pronounced dead. During his lifetime, he was known by many names: the Butcher of Uganda, the Black Hitler, President for Life, but like everything, his reign eventually came to an end. Even though it's been decades, his story continues to resonate with the realities of African politics today, and his legacy serves as a cautionary tale for everyone who sits on the throne of leadership.
Thanks for watching. For more educative videos like this, kindly subscribe to our YouTube channel, like and share, and don't forget to turn on the notification bell.